Greetings. John Wesley Bready has been discussing the response to John Wesley and the early Methodists. How contemptuous, even hostile, were the responses of the traditional church goer and the press to their early taste of Methodism, which they tended to call in those days, before there was a Methodist church, enthusiasm. Bready goes on, the foregoing, alas, are representative of contemporaries who down the ages have so proverbially stoned their greatest prophets. Today, however, the leaders of the 18th century revival, stoned in more senses than one by the smart society of their own age, are not wanting for memorials. Professor Eli Halevi, in his monumental volumes on the modern history of the English people, discovers in this spiritual awakening the only consistent explanation of the highest social and moral achievements of modern England. He says, in the vast work of social organization, which is one of the dominant characteristics of 19th century England, it would be difficult to overestimate the part played by the Wesleyan revival. End of quote. We shall witness Methodism, says this brilliant French historian, bring under its influence first the dissenting sects, then the establishment, finally secular opinion. We shall explain by this movement what we may truly term the miracle of modern England. Anarchist but orderly, practical and businesslike, but religious and even pietist. Evangelical religion, Halevi pronounces, the moral cement of 19th century English society. It restrained the plutocrats who had newly risen from the masses, from vulgar ostentation and debauchery, and placed over the proletariat a select body of workmen enamored of virtue and capable of self-restraint. Evangelicalism restored in England the balance momentarily destroyed by the explosion of the revolutionary forces. End of Halevi quote. Thorold Rogers boldly asserts that he does, quote, not believe the mass of peasants could have been moved at all had it not been for the spiritual and educational stimulus which they receive from Methodist organizations, end of quote. J.R. Green claims for this revival that it, quote, changed, after a time, the whole tone of English society, end of quote. The church, he says, was restored to new life and activity. Religion carried to the hearts of the people a fresh spirit of moral zeal, while it purified our literature and our manners. A new philanthropy reformed our prisons, infused clemency and wisdom into our penal laws, abolished the slave trade, and gave the first impulse to popular education. End of the Green quote. Lecky, himself a rationalist, avers that the evangelicals gradually, quote, changed the whole spirit of the English church. They infused into it a new fire and passion of devotion, kindled a spirit of fervent philanthropy, raised the standard of clerical duty, and completely altered the whole tone and tendency of the preaching of its ministers. End of quote. Overton, too, high church historian that is, writes, quote, of the faith which enabled a man to abandon the cherished habits of a lifetime and to go forth ready to spend and be spent in his master's service, which made the selfish man self-denying, the discontented happy, the worldling spiritually minded, the drunkard sober, the sensual chaste, the liar truthful, the thief honest, the proud humble, the godless godly, the thriftless thrifty. We can only judge by the fruits which it bore. That such fruits were born is surely undeniable. That's the end of Overton's quote. And the Cambridge Modern History, after enumerating some of the greatest men of the 18th century, adds, quote, but more important than any of these in universality of influence and range of achievement were John Wesley and the religious revival to which he gave his name and his life. End of quote. The Right Honorable Augustine Birrell writes, quote, no man lived nearer to the center than John Wesley, whether neither Pitt nor Clive, neither Mansfield nor Johnson. You cannot cut him out of the national life. No single figure influenced so many minds, no single voice touched so many hearts. No other man did such a life's work for England, end of quote. Even primates and prime ministers are at last awakening to the centrality of Wesley's influence on the English-speaking world. Archbishop Davidson, in 1928, after pronouncing Wesley, quote, one of the greatest Englishmen who ever lived, end of quote, declared that it was, quote, not too much to say that Wesley practically changed the outlook and even the character of the English nation, end of quote. He admitted also that the primates of the revival era were not the men to make the right response to a magnificent enthusiast like Wesley, end of quote. Mr. Lloyd George, when Prime Minister in 1922, avowed that Wales, quote, owed more to the movement of which Wesley was the inspirer and leader than to any other movement in the whole of its history. It civilized the people. There was a complete revolution effected in the whole country. And that's the end of the Lloyd George quote. As for the wider impact of this movement, Lloyd George affirmed that, quote, it had given a different outlook to the British and American people from the outlook of Continentals, end of quote. Lord Baldwin, commenting as Prime Minister on Wesley's labors, said, quote, I am supposed to be a busy man, but by the side of Wesley, I join the unemployed, end of quote. He said, too, that historians of the 18th century who filled their pages with Napoleon and had nothing to say of John Wesley, then they now realize that they cannot explain 19th century England until they can explain Wesley. Then poignantly he added, quote, and I believe it is equally true to say that you cannot understand 20th century America unless you understand Wesley. Well, those are pretty amazing testimonials. Then we're forced to ask, nowadays, in 2021, why in a day when we hear endlessly about slavery and racism do we hear nothing about John Wesley and his spiritual descendants, William Wilberforce, for instance? Why? I'll put a link into Wilberforce, Wheat and Weeds. We who are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses heard nothing about John Wesley's influence and nothing at all about William Wilberforce. So that video, Wilberforce, Wheat and Weeds, I'll put a link to, and also to the playlist where this series begins. What has Christ been doing these 2,000 years?